The giant white stallion had sent 7 trainers running for their lives, one barely escaping with his skull intact after those deadly hooves came within inches of crushing bone. When a silver-haired veteran with trembling hands and haunted eyes stood alone in the barn with the beast everyone called untamable, what happened next made grown men weep. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The rain hammered against the old barn roof like 1,000 angry fists, each drop a reminder of the storm that had been brewing for days over the valley. Inside the massive structure, the air was thick with tension and the smell of damp hay. Thunder rolled across the sky, shaking the wooden beams, and with each boom, the giant white stallion in the center of the barn grew more agitated. His eyes, wild and untrusting, scanned every corner of his prison. This was Goliath, a horse whose reputation had spread across 3 counties, a creature so fierce and unpredictable that men spoke his name in hushed tones, as if saying it too loudly might summon his wrath. The Morrison Ranch had been a place of pride once, known for breeding the finest horses in the state. But that was before Goliath arrived, before the accidents, before the fear took root in every worker's heart. The stallion had come to them through an auction, a magnificent specimen standing nearly 18 hands high with a coat that gleamed like fresh snow and muscles that rippled with raw power. Thomas Morrison, the ranch owner, had seen potential in those eyes, a spirit that reminded him of the wild mustangs his grandfather used to speak about. He had paid a fortune for the horse, certain that with time and proper training, Goliath would become the crown jewel of his breeding program. But from the moment Goliath's hooves touched Morrison land, it became clear that this was no ordinary horse. The first trainer, a man with 20 years of experience and countless success stories, lasted exactly 4 days. On the 4th morning, Goliath had reared up without warning, his massive hooves slicing through the air mere inches from the trainer's head. The man had stumbled backward, falling hard against the fence, and when he finally picked himself up, his face was pale as chalk. He walked straight to his truck, never even collecting his final paycheck, and was never seen at the ranch again. The second trainer was a woman from California, someone who claimed to use revolutionary gentle methods that could calm even the most troubled horses. She arrived with confidence, carrying leather-bound journals filled with techniques and philosophies. She lasted a week. Goliath had tolerated her presence at first, allowing her to approach, to speak in those soft, measured tones she was so proud of. But on the 7th day, something shifted. The stallion had turned on her so suddenly that she barely had time to scramble over the fence. She left that same afternoon, her journals abandoned in the dust, her confidence shattered like glass. One by one they came. The horse whisperer from Montana, the former rodeo champion from Texas, the elderly gentleman who had trained horses for the royal family in England. Each arrived with their own methods, their own certainties, their own pride, and each left defeated, sometimes frightened, always humbled. Goliath remained untouched, untamed, growing more dangerous with each failed attempt. The ranch hands began to avoid the barn where he was kept. They would peer through the cracks in the wood, watching the massive stallion pace back and forth, his hooves striking the ground with such force that the earth itself seemed to tremble. Thomas Morrison was a stubborn man, but even his resolve was beginning to crack. The horse was costing him money, costing him reputation, and worst of all, costing him sleep. At night, he would lie awake, listening to the distant sounds of Goliath's movements, the sharp cracks of hooves against wood, the occasional piercing whinny that seemed to carry both rage and something else, something that sounded almost like loneliness. His wife, Margaret, had suggested more than once that they should simply sell the horse, cut their losses, but Thomas couldn't bring himself to do it. There was something about Goliath, something in those eyes that made him believe the horse wasn't evil or mean-spirited. He was wounded somehow, carrying a pain that manifested as fury. The other horses on the ranch had learned to give Goliath a wide berth. Even separated by fences and distance, they could sense his presence, his energy that seemed to charge the very air around him. The mares would shift nervously when the wind carried his scent their way. The younger stallions, normally so eager to prove themselves, would retreat to the far corners of their paddocks. It was as if Goliath existed in a category all his own, neither fully horse nor fully beast, but something in between, something that defied all the usual rules and understanding. On this particular stormy evening, with lightning splitting the sky and rain turning the earth to mud, Thomas stood at the barn entrance with 3 of his most trusted ranch hands. They had gathered not to attempt another training session, but simply to ensure that Goliath's stall was secure, that the storm wasn't causing any damage that might allow the massive stallion to break free. The thought of Goliath loose in a storm like this was enough to make even the bravest man's blood run cold. Inside the barn, Goliath sensed their presence. His ears flicked back, his nostrils flared, and his massive body tensed like a coiled spring. The whites of his eyes showed as he tossed his head, his long mane flying like a silver banner. He was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, a living testament to the untamed spirit that still existed in the world. A reminder that not everything could be controlled or conquered. The men stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the storm, watching him with a mixture of awe and apprehension, none of them daring to step closer, none of them willing to be the next to try and fail. The morning after the storm arrived with an eerie stillness, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Thomas Morrison stood on his front porch, coffee in hand, surveying the damage the night had left behind. Broken branches littered the yard, puddles reflected the pale morning sky, and in the distance the barn stood silent. Too silent. He had checked on Goliath twice during the night, shining his flashlight through the cracks to see those luminous eyes staring back at him, unblinking, almost accusatory. The horse had weathered the storm without incident, but Thomas knew this couldn't continue indefinitely. Something had to change. As he stood there, lost in thought, a truck turned into the long driveway leading to the ranch. It was an old vehicle, at least 20 years past its prime, with rust spots blooming along the wheel wells and a faded blue paint job that had seen better days. The truck moved slowly, deliberately, as if the driver was taking in every detail of the property. Thomas didn't recognize the vehicle, and unexpected visitors were rare this far out. He set his coffee down on the porch rail and waited, watching as the truck came to a stop near the main house. The door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, though age had begun to bow his shoulders slightly, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been through more than its fair share of hardship. His hair was silver, cut military short, and his face was weathered like old leather, carved with lines that spoke of years spent outdoors and experiences that had left their mark. He wore simple clothes, faded jeans and a worn denim shirt, and on his feet were boots that had clearly walked many miles. But it was his eyes that caught Thomas's attention. They were blue, clear as a winter sky, and they held a depth that suggested this was a man who had seen things, understood things, that most people never would. The stranger approached with an unhurried gait, and when he reached the porch steps, he nodded respectfully. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but carried a weight that demanded attention. He introduced himself as James Sullivan, though he said most people just called him Sully. He had heard about the horse, he explained, heard the stories that were circulating through the county about the giant white stallion that nobody could tame. Thomas felt a familiar mixture of hope and skepticism rising in his chest. How many times had he heard similar words? How many confident men had stood in this very spot, certain they would be the one to succeed where others had failed? But there was something different about this man. He didn't boast about his credentials or share stories of past triumphs. He didn't promise quick results or guaranteed success. Instead, he simply asked if he could see the horse, and there was something in the way he asked, something humble and genuine, that made Thomas agree. They walked together toward the barn, the older man's boots squelching in the muddy earth, neither speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached, Thomas began to share Goliath's history, or at least what little he knew of it. The horse had come from a breeding farm in Kentucky, a place with an excellent reputation. But there had been an incident there, something that the previous owners had been reluctant to discuss in detail. From what Thomas had been able to piece together, there had been a fire, a terrible blaze that had torn through one of the barns in the middle of the night. Several horses had been lost, and Goliath, then just a young stallion, had been trapped inside. By the time they managed to free him, something fundamental had changed. The gentle, promising young horse had become a creature of pure instinct and fear, lashing out at anyone who came near. Sully listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. When they reached the barn, Thomas gestured toward the large stall at the far end, the one they had reinforced with extra boards and heavier locks. He started to warn Sully about getting too close, about the danger, but the older man was already moving forward, his steps measured and calm. Thomas watched, his heart beating faster, ready to shout a warning if needed, but Sully stopped several feet from the stall, maintaining a respectful distance. Goliath was there, of course, standing in the shadows. The morning light filtering through the cracks in the barn walls created stripes across his white coat, and his eyes, those intense, wary eyes, were fixed on this new human who had dared to enter his domain. For a long moment, nothing happened. The two simply looked at each other, man and horse, separated by wooden bars and years of accumulated pain and mistrust. Thomas found himself holding his breath, waiting for the explosion, for Goliath to rear up and scream his fury as he had done so many times before. But it didn't come. Instead, something strange happened. Goliath's ears, which had been pinned flat against his head, flickered forward slightly. It was a tiny movement, barely noticeable, but Thomas had spent enough time around horses to know what it meant. The stallion was curious, engaged in a way he hadn't been with any of the other trainers. Sully didn't move closer, didn't reach out his hand or speak soothing words. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed, his breathing steady, existing in the space with a patience that seemed limitless. Minutes passed. The silence in the barn was profound, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the roof and the distant sounds of the ranch coming to life around them. Thomas shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the stillness, but Sully remained motionless, his focus entirely on the horse. And then, so gradually that Thomas almost missed it, Goliath took a single step forward. Just one. His massive hoof pressed into the straw bedding with barely a whisper of sound, and his neck extended slightly, his nostrils flaring as he tried to catch the scent of this stranger who refused to behave like all the others who had come before. Thomas watched in stunned silence as Sully slowly lowered himself to sit on an old wooden crate near the stall, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The veteran settled into a comfortable position, as if he had all the time in the world, as if sitting near a dangerous, unpredictable stallion was the most natural thing imaginable. He didn't stare directly at Goliath, but kept his gaze soft, occasionally looking away, a gesture that in the language of horses meant peace, meant safety. This was not the behavior of any trainer Thomas had ever witnessed. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, Sully rose to his feet with the same careful deliberation and walked back to where Thomas stood. The ranch owner expected him to launch into an explanation, a plan of action, perhaps a list of requirements or conditions. Instead, Sully simply asked if he could return the next day, same time. He didn't ask for payment, didn't negotiate terms, didn't even confirm whether he intended to work with the horse. He just asked to come back. Thomas, bewildered but intrigued, agreed. Over the following days, a routine established itself. Each morning, just after sunrise, the old blue truck would appear at the end of the driveway. Sully would arrive, greet Thomas with a brief nod, and make his way to the barn. And there he would sit, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 3, simply existing in Goliath's presence. He never tried to touch the horse, never attempted to enter the stall, never even spoke, except for the occasional soft word that seemed more like an acknowledgement of shared space than any attempt at communication. The ranch hands thought he was crazy. They would gather at a distance, watching this strange old man sitting motionless, while one of the most dangerous horses any of them had ever seen gradually, almost imperceptibly, relaxed in his presence. Margaret Morrison brought Sully coffee one morning, curious about the man who had captured her husband's cautious optimism. She found him sitting on his usual crate, and Goliath standing near the front of his stall, closer than he had ever voluntarily positioned himself near a human. When she asked Sully what his secret was, he smiled faintly and said there was no secret, only time and respect. On the 5th day, something remarkable happened. Sully had been sitting in his usual spot, the morning sun creating long shadows across the barn floor, when Goliath approached the bars of his stall and lowered his massive head. His nostrils flared, taking in Sully's scent, and for the first time since arriving at the Morrison Ranch, the tension seemed to drain from the stallion's powerful body. His ears were forward, his eyes soft, and when Sully slowly raised his hand, not reaching toward the horse but simply lifting it into Goliath's line of sight, the stallion didn't flinch, didn't retreat. He watched that hand with interest rather than fear, a small but monumental shift in his demeanor. Thomas, observing from his usual position near the barn entrance, felt something tighten in his chest. He had begun to lose hope, had started to believe that Goliath was beyond reach, that whatever trauma the horse carried was too deep, too consuming to ever heal. But watching Sully work, if it could even be called work, was like witnessing something sacred. This wasn't training in any conventional sense. This was something else entirely, something that looked more like two wounded souls recognizing each other across the divide of species. That evening, after Sully had left for the day, Thomas invited him to dinner. The veteran accepted, and over Margaret's pot roast, the real story began to emerge. Sully didn't offer it freely. He was clearly a private man, but when Thomas asked directly about his experience with horses, the older man's reserve cracked just enough to let some light through. He had grown up on a ranch in Wyoming, he explained, had learned to ride before he could properly walk. Horses had been his first language, more fluent than English ever was. Then came the war. Sully didn't specify which one, and Thomas didn't press. But the way his eyes grew distant, the way his hands stilled around his coffee cup, spoke volumes. He had been young when he enlisted, full of certainty about right and wrong, about duty and honor. The man who came back years later understood that the world was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. He had seen things, done things, that left scars no doctor could treat. The nightmares came regularly, the sudden panic attacks, the inability to be in crowds or loud places. What the doctors now called post-traumatic stress disorder had been, for his generation, something you simply didn't talk about. He had tried to return to normal life, Sully continued, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of old pain. He had married, started a family, attempted to build the life everyone expected, but the demons followed him home. His wife had tried to understand, had been patient beyond measure, but eventually the distance between who he had been and who he had become was too vast to bridge. The divorce was quiet, amicable even, but it hollowed him out. His children, grown now with families of their own, called occasionally, but the conversations were strained, full of unspoken history. For years, Sully drifted, He took odd jobs, moved from town to town, existing rather than living. He avoided people, avoided connection, built walls so high that nothing could reach him. And then, almost by accident, he found himself working at a horse rescue in Montana. The place took in animals that had been abused, neglected, traumatized beyond what most people thought could be healed. His job was simple: mucking stalls, repairing fences, basic labor that didn't require interaction or emotional investment. But one horse changed everything. A mare that had been so badly beaten she wouldn't let anyone within 20 feet of her. The other workers had given up, resigned to the idea that some creatures were just too broken. Sully hadn't intended to work with her, hadn't planned anything. He simply started sitting near her paddock during his lunch breaks, eating his sandwich in silence while she watched him from the far corner. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, so slowly he almost didn't notice it happening, the mare began to approach. Not close, never close enough to touch, but closer than she had let anyone else come. It took 3 months, but eventually that mare allowed Sully to touch her. And in that moment, when his hand made contact with her trembling neck, something broke open in both of them. She wasn't the only one who was broken, he realized. He wasn't the only one carrying invisible wounds. They recognized each other, understood each other in a way that transcended words or reason. From that day forward, Sully had dedicated himself to these horses, the ones everyone else had given up on, the ones whose trauma made them dangerous or difficult or impossible. Because he understood them, because he was them. The morning of the 10th day marked a turning point that nobody could have predicted. Sully arrived as usual, but this time he carried with him a worn leather satchel that looked as old as he did. Thomas watched from a distance as the veteran made his way to the barn, his steps slightly slower than usual, as if whatever was in that bag carried more than physical weight. Inside, Goliath was waiting, and over the past days his behavior had transformed so gradually that it was almost imperceptible until you stepped back and saw the full picture. The horse who had once pressed himself against the back wall now stood at the front of his stall, ears pricked forward, watching for Sully's arrival like a dog waiting for its owner to come home. Sully settled onto his crate and opened the satchel, pulling out an old harmonica. The instrument was tarnished, its metal surface marked with scratches and dents that testified to decades of use. He held it up to the light for a moment, as if seeing an old friend after a long absence, then brought it to his lips. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, a simple melody that drifted through the barn like morning mist. Goliath's ears twitched, swiveling toward the sound, his large eyes fixed on Sully with an intensity that was no longer aggressive, but deeply curious. The music continued, and Sully's fingers moved across the harmonica with practiced ease despite the years that had passed since he'd last played. It was a folk tune, something old and plaintive, the kind of song that cowboys used to play around campfires when the world was quieter and the stars seemed closer. As the melody wove through the air, something extraordinary happened. Goliath moved forward until his nose nearly touched the bars of his stall, and his massive body, usually held with such tension, relaxed. His head lowered slightly, his breathing deepened, and his eyes, those windows into a soul that had known such fear and pain, softened with something that looked remarkably like peace. When the song ended, Sully lowered the harmonica and sat in silence, letting the last notes fade into the dusty air. He glanced at Goliath and saw that the horse was still watching him, but now there was no wariness in that gaze, no calculation about whether this human represented a threat. There was only connection, a bridge built note by note across the chasm of trauma that had separated this magnificent creature from the world. Sully spoke then, his voice low and gentle, telling Goliath things he had never told another living soul. He spoke about the war, about the friends he had lost, about the nightmares that still woke him in the darkest hours. He spoke about the crushing weight of guilt, of survival when others had fallen, of the impossible task of returning to a world that expected you to be the same person who had left. And Goliath listened. Whether he understood the words themselves or simply responded to the emotion carried within them, the horse stood perfectly still, his attention never wavering. In that moment, something profound occurred that neither Thomas nor any of the ranch hands watching from a respectful distance could fully comprehend. Two beings, separated by species but united by suffering, found in each other a kind of understanding that went beyond language or logic. Sully reached into his satchel again and pulled out a worn apple, its skin slightly wrinkled but still firm. He held it in his open palm, making no move to extend it toward the bars, simply offering it as a gift freely given with no expectation of acceptance. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then Goliath took a step forward, his massive hooves making soft thuds against the straw-covered floor. Another step, another, until finally his velvet nose extended through the bars and his lips, surprisingly gentle for such a powerful creature, lifted the apple from Sully's palm. The crunch of teeth meeting fruit echoed through the barn, and Thomas, watching from the shadows, felt tears prick at his eyes. It was such a simple thing, such a small gesture, but it represented a victory more significant than any championship or blue ribbon could ever be. Over the following days, the progress accelerated. Sully began spending entire days at the ranch, and Thomas offered him the small cottage on the property that had been sitting empty since the previous foreman retired. The veteran accepted with quiet gratitude, and that evening he moved his few possessions into the modest dwelling. He didn't own much, a truth that spoke to a life deliberately kept simple, unburdened by attachments that might become too heavy to carry. His truck, his clothes, his harmonica, and a single photograph of his children taken years ago when they were still young enough to look at him with uncomplicated love. That was the sum total of his material existence. With Sully living on the property, his time with Goliath became less structured and more natural. He would visit the barn in the early morning, then again in the afternoon, and often in the evening when the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. During these visits, he began introducing new elements slowly and carefully. A rope left hanging near the stall, where Goliath could investigate it at his leisure. A halter placed just inside the bars, never forced upon the horse but simply present, available, waiting for curiosity to overcome caution. On the 14th day, Sully opened the stall door. He didn't step inside, didn't try to enter Goliath's space. He simply opened the door and stepped back, creating an opportunity rather than an obligation. The ranch hands, when they realized what was happening, gathered at a safe distance, some fearful, others fascinated, all unable to look away. Thomas appeared at the barn entrance, his face a mixture of hope and anxiety. If Goliath bolted, if he charged, if he decided to use this freedom to unleash all the pent-up energy and fear he had been containing, the consequences could be catastrophic. But Goliath didn't bolt. He stood in his stall, looking at the open door with an expression that in a human might have been called surprise. His ears swiveled forward and back, processing this new development. Sully remained where he was, leaning against the barn wall with his arms crossed loosely over his chest, his posture radiating calm and patience. He began to hum, the same melody he had played on his harmonica, and the familiar sound seemed to ground Goliath in the moment, reminding him of the connection they had built note by note, day by day. Minutes stretched into an hour. The assembled watchers began to shift restlessly, whispering among themselves, wondering if anything would happen. And then, so slowly that at first it seemed imaginary, Goliath placed one hoof outside the stall. He paused, testing this new reality, then brought his other front hoof forward. His massive head emerged from the enclosure, his neck stretching as he took in the larger space of the barn. Step by careful step, The giant white stallion walked out of his prison, and he walked directly toward Sully, stopping just inches away from the man who had shown him that not all humans were threats, that safety was possible, that trust could be rebuilt. The moment Goliath's breath touched Sully's face, warm and grassy, time seemed to suspend itself. Thomas held his breath along with everyone else watching, afraid that any sound or movement might shatter the fragile magic of what was unfolding. Sully remained perfectly still, his eyes soft, his hands at his sides, giving Goliath complete control of the interaction. The stallion's nostrils flared as he took in Sully's scent, cataloging every detail, his whiskers twitching with each careful inhalation. This was not the quick, nervous investigation of a frightened animal, but the thorough examination of a creature making a conscious decision about trust. Slowly, so slowly that the movement was almost imperceptible, Sully raised one hand. Not toward Goliath's head or neck, where most people instinctively tried to touch a horse, but simply up into the space between them, palm open, fingers relaxed. He held it there, an offering rather than a demand, letting Goliath decide if and when contact would happen. The stallion's ears flicked forward, his gaze fixed on that weathered hand with its calluses and scars, the physical map of a life lived hard. Several seconds passed, then Goliath lowered his massive head and pressed his velvety nose into Sully's palm. The touch was electric, not in intensity, but in significance. It was a choice, a gift, a bridge across years of fear and isolation. Sully's fingers, still gentle, moved slightly, the barest whisper of a caress against Goliath's soft muzzle. The horse didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the contact, seeking more, and a sound escaped him, a low rumble from deep in his chest that was neither aggressive nor fearful, but something else entirely. It was a sound of relief, of recognition, of a burden being set down after carrying it for far too long. That first touch opened a door that had been locked and barred for years. Over the next several days, Sully and Goliath explored this new territory together, establishing boundaries and building a language all their own. Sully would run his hands along Goliath's powerful neck, feeling the muscles beneath the silky coat, tracing old scars that spoke of the fire and the terror that had created them. He found a particularly nasty mark along Goliath's shoulder, a thick ridge of scar tissue that must have been agonizing when fresh, and when his fingers touched it, the stallion flinched, but didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his head and looked at Sully with eyes that seemed to say he understood that this touch was different, that it acknowledged pain rather than causing it. The ranch hands, initially skeptical, now watched the daily interactions with something approaching reverence. Word had spread beyond the Morrison Ranch about what was happening, and people began finding excuses to drive by, to catch a glimpse of the legendary untamable horse standing peacefully beside the quiet veteran. Some brought cameras, hoping to capture proof of what they were witnessing, but Thomas, protective of both Sully and Goliath's privacy, gently but firmly turned away anyone who seemed more interested in spectacle than genuine understanding. Margaret Morrison found herself drawn to the barn as well, though she tried to maintain a respectful distance. One afternoon, she brought fresh lemonade for Sully and found him sitting in the barn with Goliath's head resting against his shoulder, the massive stallion's eyes half closed in contentment. The image struck her with unexpected force. Here was a horse that had terrorized grown men, that had been deemed dangerous and unpredictable, resting against an old veteran like a child seeking comfort. And here was a man who had arrived at their ranch broken and solitary, now surrounded by a peace that seemed to emanate from the very core of his being. Sully noticed her presence and looked up, and for the first time since his arrival, Margaret saw him smile. It wasn't a big smile, nothing theatrical or forced. just a gentle upward curve of his lips that transformed his weathered face. She smiled back, set down the lemonade, and left without a word, understanding instinctively that some moments are too sacred for conversation, that sometimes silence is the most profound form of communication. The real test came on a bright Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Sully had first arrived. Thomas had suggested, cautiously, that perhaps it was time to try moving Goliath to the outdoor paddock, to let him experience open space again under controlled circumstances. Sully had considered the idea carefully, spending an extra hour with Goliath that morning, assessing his state of mind, his readiness for this next step. Finally, he nodded his agreement, but on one condition: no audience, no spectators or helpful hands. Just him, Goliath, and the space to succeed or fail without pressure. Thomas agreed, though it took considerable effort to convince the ranch hands to make themselves scarce. They scattered to various tasks across the property, though several positioned themselves where they could see the barn from a distance, unable to completely relinquish their curiosity or their concern. Sully led Goliath out of the barn without a halter or lead rope, simply walking beside him, trusting that the bond they had built would be enough. The stallion followed, his massive hooves leaving deep imprints in the soft earth, his head level with Sully's shoulder. The paddock gate stood open, and beyond it stretched a quarter-acre of green grass, fenced but vast compared to the confines of the stall. Goliath stopped at the threshold, his body tensing. Memories of the last time he had run free perhaps flooding back. The fire had started in an outdoor area after all, and the association between open space and danger might still be deeply embedded in his psyche. Sully stopped as well, not pushing, not pulling, just being present. He began to hum again, that same melody that had become their shared language, and Goliath's ears rotated toward the sound. Then, making a decision that would define everything that came after, Goliath stepped through the gate. His first few steps were tentative, testing, but as his hooves met the soft grass, something shifted in his bearing. His head lifted higher, his nostrils flared to take in the scent of earth and growing things, and then, in a moment of pure joy that took Sully's breath away, Goliath broke into a run. Not a panicked flight, but a celebration, his powerful legs eating up the ground, his white coat gleaming in the sunlight, his mane and tail streaming behind him like silver banners. He was magnificent. He was free, and most importantly, he was choosing to be both of those things. Sully stood at the fence, his hands resting lightly on the top rail, watching Goliath move with a freedom the stallion hadn't experienced in years. The horse ran the perimeter of the paddock once, twice, 3 times each circuit, loosening muscles that had been held tense for too long. Finally, after what must have been his 10th lap, Goliath slowed to a trot, then a walk, and eventually made his way back to where Sully waited. The stallion was breathing hard, his coat darkened with sweat, but his eyes were bright with something that looked remarkably like happiness. He approached Sully and pressed his forehead against the veteran's chest, and Sully wrapped his arms around that massive head, holding on as if both their lives depended on it. The success of that day seemed to unlock something in Goliath. Each morning he would wait by the gate of his stall, ears pricked forward, eager for Sully's arrival and the adventures the day might bring. They established a routine that worked for both of them. Morning feeding, followed by grooming sessions where Sully would brush Goliath's coat until it gleamed like fresh snow, talking quietly all the while about nothing and everything. He told Goliath about his daughter's wedding that he hadn't attended because the thought of being in a crowd made his chest tight and his hands shake. He talked about his son who had followed in his footsteps and enlisted, and the terror that kept Sully awake at night imagining history repeating itself. Goliath, for his part, seemed to understand that these confessions were gifts, sacred trusts that required protection. He would stand perfectly still during these monologues, occasionally turning his head to nuzzle Sully's shoulder or breathe warm air against his neck. The horse had become Sully's confessor, his therapist, his best friend, all rolled into one magnificent package. And in caring for Goliath, in meeting the horse's needs and celebrating his small victories, Sully found himself healing in ways he hadn't thought possible. Thomas Morrison watched all of this unfold with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. His ranch, which had been shadowed by Goliath's presence and the string of failures that preceded Sully's arrival, now felt lighter somehow. The other horses seemed to sense the change too. Where before they had given the giant stallion's barn a wide berth, now they grazed peacefully in nearby paddocks, no longer disturbed by the violent energy that had once emanated from Goliath like heat from a fire. Even the ranch hands, those tough practical men who measured value in dollars and utility, had softened toward both the horse and the veteran who had saved him. But not everything was smooth sailing. One afternoon, about a month into Sully's time at the ranch, a violent thunderstorm rolled in from the west. The sky turned the color of old bruises, and the wind picked up, bending trees and sending loose items tumbling across the yard. Sully was in the barn with Goliath when the first crack of thunder split the air, and he felt the stallion's entire body go rigid beneath his hands. The horse's eyes, which had been soft and trusting moments before, suddenly went wide and white-rimmed. His nostrils flared, his breathing became rapid and shallow, and Sully recognized immediately what was happening. The storm was triggering memories of the fire, pulling Goliath back into that night of terror and pain. The veteran's own heart began to race, his own demons stirred by Goliath's panic. Loud noises had been a trigger for him since the war. Thunder too close to the sound of artillery, lightning flashes too similar to explosions on the horizon. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the way his vision seemed to narrow and darken at the edges. But in that moment, looking at Goliath's fear, something shifted in Sully. He couldn't afford to fall apart. The horse needed him to be strong, to be present, to be the anchor in this storm, both literal and metaphorical. Sully began to sing. His voice was rough, unpracticed, but the words came anyway. An old lullaby his mother had sung to him when he was small, and the world was still a place that made sense. The lyrics spoke of safety and home, of storms passing and morning coming, of love that endured through darkness. As he sang, he moved closer to Goliath, placing one hand on the horse's trembling neck, letting his own heartbeat slow and strengthen, willing that calm into the panicked animal. Goliath's ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull, began to swivel toward the sound of Sully's voice. The storm raged outside, rain hammering the roof, thunder shaking the very foundations of the barn. But inside, in that small circle of connection, man and horse found an island of peace. Sully sang song after song, his repertoire expanding to include half-remembered hymns and folk tunes, and eventually, just wordless melodies. His hand never left Goliath's neck, that physical connection serving as a lifeline for both of them. Gradually, so gradually that Sully almost didn't notice when it happened, Goliath's breathing slowed. The wild panic in his eyes faded, replaced by something steadier, more grounded. When the storm finally passed, leaving behind only the gentle patter of rain and the clean smell of washed earth, Goliath lowered his head and rested his chin on Sully's shoulder. The gesture was so trusting, so vulnerable, that Sully felt his eyes burn with unshed tears. They had weathered the storm together, both the one outside and the ones that lived in their hearts. And in doing so, they had proven something essential. They were stronger together than either could be alone. That night, after Goliath had settled into his stall and Sully had made his way back to his cottage, the veteran lay in bed unable to sleep. But for once, it wasn't nightmares keeping him awake. It was a realization, profound and unsettling. In healing Goliath, in giving the horse the patience and understanding he needed to recover from his trauma, Sully had accidentally begun healing himself. The careful attention he paid to Goliath's triggers and fears had made him more aware of his own. The compassion he showed the stallion had taught him to be gentler with himself. The hope he felt when Goliath made progress had reminded him that recovery, while never linear and never complete, was possible. He thought about calling his daughter, about reaching out after years of silence and distance. The thought terrified him, bringing with it all the familiar anxiety and shame. But then he remembered how Goliath had looked at him during the storm, how the horse had chosen trust even when every instinct screamed to run. If a traumatized stallion could take that leap of faith, maybe a broken veteran could too. Sully pulled out his phone, stared at his daughter's number for a long time, and finally, hands shaking only slightly, typed out a simple message. Just a few words, but they felt monumental. He told her he was thinking of her, that he was sorry for the distance, that if she was willing, he would like to try again. The response from Sully's daughter came 3 days later. He was in the barn brushing Goliath when his phone buzzed in his pocket. His hands froze mid-stroke, and the horse, sensitive to every shift in his emotional state, turned his head to look at him with concern. Sully pulled out the phone with trembling fingers and stared at the screen. Sarah had written back. The message was brief, careful, but it held a note of cautious hope that made Sully's chest tighten. She said she was glad to hear from him, that she had been thinking about him too, and that maybe they could talk sometime, really talk, when he was ready. She signed it with a simple heart emoji, and that tiny digital symbol carried more weight than any words could have. Sully showed the message to Goliath, holding the phone up as if the horse could read it. Maybe he could, in his own way. The stallion nickered softly and bumped his nose against Sully's chest, a gesture that had become his version of a hug. The veteran laughed, the sound rusty but genuine, and wrapped his arms around Goliath's neck. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the future felt like something other than an endless stretch of gray days. It felt like possibility. The weeks rolled by, and spring began asserting itself with determination. Wildflowers dotted the fields in splashes of yellow and purple. The morning air lost its sharp edge, becoming soft and welcoming. Goliath's transformation continued to amaze everyone who witnessed it. The horse who had once been a prisoner of his own fear now moved through the world with confidence and grace. He still had his moments, times when a sudden noise or an unexpected movement would cause him to tense, but he had learned to look to Sully first, to check whether this new thing was a threat or simply part of the world's normal chaos. Thomas Morrison began to discuss with Sully what came next. The original plan had been to train Goliath for breeding, to use his magnificent bloodlines and physical perfection to improve the ranch's stock. But both men had come to understand that Goliath was not meant for that life. He was special in ways that transcended genetics and conformation. He was a teacher, a healer, a living testament to the power of patience and understanding. Thomas, in a decision that surprised even himself, suggested that perhaps Goliath's purpose was different than they had imagined. Perhaps he could work with other troubled horses or visit schools and veteran centers, showing people that recovery was possible. Sully liked the idea but knew it would require one more step in Goliath's journey. The horse would need to accept a saddle and rider, not for domination or control, but for partnership. They had been building toward this moment for weeks, introducing equipment gradually, letting Goliath investigate each new item at his own pace. The saddle pad had been easy, just another blanket to him. The saddle itself had taken longer, but eventually Goliath had stood calmly while Sully placed it on his back and tightened the girth, trusting that this weight and restriction served a purpose he didn't need to fully understand. But riding was different. Riding meant vulnerability for both of them. It meant Goliath allowing a predator onto his back, trusting that predator not to harm him. It meant Sully putting his life in the hands, or rather hooves, of a creature that could kill him with one well-placed kick. The morning they chose for the first attempt was clear and cool, perfect weather that seemed designed for new beginnings. Sully led Goliath to the round pen, a smaller enclosed area where the horse could move freely but couldn't build up too much speed. Several ranch hands had gathered to watch, though at Thomas's stern instruction they kept their distance and their voices low. Sully took his time, going through all their usual rituals. He groomed Goliath thoroughly, checked each hoof, adjusted the saddle twice even though it was already perfect. He was stalling, he knew, and Goliath seemed to know it too. The horse stood patiently through all these ministrations, occasionally turning his head to give Sully a look that seemed to say he understood this was difficult, that he would wait as long as necessary. Finally, when there were no more preparations to make, Sully took a deep breath and placed his foot in the stirrup. Goliath's muscles tensed, every line of his body suddenly alert, but he didn't move. Sully paused, his weight still mostly on the ground, giving the horse time to adjust to this new sensation. He spoke quietly, a stream of reassurance and gratitude, reminding Goliath that they were partners, that they were safe. Then, in one smooth motion, he swung his leg over Goliath's back and settled gently into the saddle. For a moment, nothing happened. The world held its breath. Then Goliath took a single step forward, testing this new reality. Another step. He walked the perimeter of the round pen, his gait smooth and controlled, while Sully sat perfectly balanced above him, his hands light on the reins, his body moving in harmony with the horse's motion. The watching ranch hands began to murmur in amazement, but Sully barely heard them. His entire focus was on Goliath, on the miracle of this connection, on the trust that had been built touch by touch, day by day, trauma by trauma. They walked together like that for perhaps 20 minutes, Sully making no demands, simply existing in this shared experience. When he finally dismounted, sliding carefully from Goliath's back, his legs were shaking and his eyes were wet. He pressed his forehead against Goliath's neck and whispered, "Thank you," over and over, though he couldn't have said exactly what he was thanking the horse for trusting him, for teaching him, for being the reason he had learned to hope again. That evening, Sully called his daughter. Not a text this time, but an actual phone call. When she answered, her voice hesitant but warm, he found words he didn't know he possessed. He told her about Goliath, about the journey they had been on together. He told her he was sorry for all the years he had been absent, sorry for letting his pain create walls between them. He told her he was trying to be better, to heal, and that he would understand if it was too late, if she couldn't forgive him. There was silence on the other end, and Sully's heart began to sink. But then Sarah spoke, her voice thick with emotion, and she said it wasn't too late. It could never be too late. And could she maybe come visit, meet this horse who had brought her father back to life? Sarah arrived on a Saturday afternoon 2 weeks later, driving a sensible sedan that looked out of place among the trucks and utility vehicles that populated the ranch. Sully watched from the porch of his cottage as she parked and stepped out, and for a moment he was transported back in time, seeing not the woman she had become, but the little girl who used to run to him when he came home from work, arms outstretched, believing with absolute certainty that her daddy could fix anything. That certainty had been shattered long ago, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the pieces. She was taller than he remembered, or perhaps he had simply shrunk with age and hardship. Her hair, once the same dark brown as his had been, was lighter now, touched with honey highlights that caught the sun. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, casual but neat, and when their eyes met across the distance, he saw his own nervousness reflected back at him. They stood frozen for several heartbeats, neither quite sure how to bridge the physical and emotional space between them. Then Sarah smiled, tentative but real, and Sully found his feet moving of their own accord. The hug was awkward at first, both of them uncertain about boundaries and permissions, but then Sarah's arms tightened around him, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and Sully felt something inside him that had been clenched tight for years finally begin to loosen. They stayed like that for a long moment, not speaking, just breathing together, relearning the shape and feel of each other. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears in their eyes, but they were the good kind, the healing kind. After coffee and halting conversation that gradually grew easier as they found their rhythm, Sully took Sarah to meet Goliath. He had been both eager and anxious about this introduction, wondering how the horse would react to a new person, especially one who carried such emotional significance. But Goliath, as he so often did, seemed to understand exactly what was needed. When Sarah approached the paddock fence, the massive stallion walked over with calm dignity, his movements deliberate and gentle. He stretched his neck over the fence and exhaled softly against Sarah's extended hand, his whiskers tickling her palm. Sarah laughed, a sound of pure delight that Sully hadn't heard in decades, and Goliath's ears pricked forward at the noise. She looked at her father with wonder in her eyes and said that now she understood. This wasn't just a horse, this was a miracle, a gift, a second chance made flesh and blood. Sully nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, and watched as his daughter and his best friend got acquainted. Goliath, who had once been too dangerous for anyone to approach, lowered his massive head so Sarah could scratch behind his ears, and she laughed again as he leaned into the touch with obvious pleasure. The weekend of Sarah's visit passed too quickly, filled with long conversations, shared meals, and hours spent with Goliath. She told Sully about her life, her work as a teacher, her recent divorce that she hadn't told him about because they hadn't been speaking. He told her about the years he had spent drifting, about the darkness that had consumed him, and about how Goliath had given him a reason to fight his way back to the light. On her last evening at the ranch, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Sarah took her father's hand and said she wanted to be part of his life again. Really part of it, not just occasional phone calls and awkward visits. She wanted to know him, this version of him, the man he was becoming. After Sarah left, promising to return soon, Sully found himself thinking about legacy and purpose. He was 63 years old, not ancient but not young either, and he had wasted so many years being lost. The work he was doing with Goliath felt important in ways he couldn't fully articulate, but it also felt incomplete, like the first chapter of a story that needed to continue. He began researching programs that used horses to help veterans with PTSD, reading everything he could find about equine therapy and the science behind why it worked. The more he learned, the more excited he became about the possibilities. He presented his idea to Thomas one evening over dinner. What if they transformed part of the Morrison Ranch into a sanctuary specifically designed for troubled horses and the people who needed them? Not a therapy center with clinical coldness, but a place where veterans and rescue horses could heal together, learning from each other's resilience. Thomas listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and by the time Margaret brought out dessert, he was nodding with growing enthusiasm. He had been thinking about his own legacy, about what would happen to the ranch when he was gone, and this felt right, felt meaningful in ways that breeding horses for profit never quite had. The next few months were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. They converted one of the older barns into a comfortable meeting space with chairs arranged in a circle and large windows that looked out onto the paddocks. They brought in 3 more rescue horses, each with their own trauma, their own story, and Sully began working with them using the methods he had developed with Goliath. Word spread through the veteran community, passed along through VA offices and support groups, about this ranch where broken horses and broken soldiers were finding their way back to wholeness. The first official session of what they had named the Goliath Project brought 6 veterans to the ranch, men and women ranging from their 20s to their 50s, representing different wars and different wounds. Sully stood before them in the barn, Goliath by his side, and felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in his chest. Public speaking had never been his strength, and standing in front of strangers talking about his trauma felt like being stripped naked. But then Goliath shifted closer, pressing his shoulder against Sully's side, and that simple touch gave him courage. He told them his story. Not the sanitized version or the abbreviated one, but the whole truth. The war, the nightmares, the failed marriage, the years of isolation and despair, the moment he found Goliath, or maybe the moment Goliath found him. As he spoke, he watched the faces of his listeners, saw his own pain reflected back at him, saw the understanding that only comes from shared experience. When he finished, the silence in the barn was heavy with emotion, and then one of the veterans, a young woman with haunted eyes, raised her hand and asked if she could meet Goliath properly. Over the following months, the Goliath Project grew beyond anything Sully or Thomas had imagined. The ranch became a sanctuary where the language of trauma was spoken fluently by both the two-legged and four-legged residents. Each veteran who came through the gate carried their own invisible wounds, their own demons that followed them like shadows. Each horse bore scars visible and hidden, memories of abuse or neglect or simple bad luck that had left them skittish or aggressive or shut down. And somehow, in the space between species, in the quiet work of grooming and feeding and simply being present, healing happened. Marcus was a Marine who had lost his left leg below the knee in an explosion that killed two of his best friends. He arrived at the ranch angry, his jaw tight, his prosthetic hidden beneath long pants as if he could pretend it didn't exist. Sully paired him with a mare named Shadow, who had been rescued from a hoarding situation, malnourished and terrified of humans. For the first week, Marcus barely spoke to anyone, spending his hours sitting near Shadow's paddock, watching her graze from a distance. The mare, for her part, ignored him completely, too absorbed in the simple joy of having enough food and space to care about the sad man on the fence. But slowly, something shifted. Marcus began bringing apples, leaving them on the fence post and retreating. Shadow would wait until he was far away, then approach and take the fruit, always watching him warily. The dance continued, the distance between them shrinking by inches. One morning, Marcus stayed by the fence while Shadow ate her apple and the mare didn't bolt. She finished her treat, then stood there, her dark eyes studying him with what looked like curiosity. Marcus reached out his hand, not expecting contact, just offering the possibility. And Shadow took 3 careful steps forward and touched her nose to his palm. When Marcus came to the weekly group session that evening, his eyes were red, but his posture was straighter than anyone had seen it. He told the group about Shadow, about how she had chosen to trust him despite every reason not to, and how that simple act of faith had cracked something open inside him. If this broken mare could find courage, he said, his voice rough with emotion, then maybe he could too. The other veterans nodded in understanding, each of them walking their own parallel journey with their assigned horses. There was Jennifer, an army medic who couldn't stop washing her hands, scrubbing at stains only she could see. She worked with a gelding named Phoenix who had been burned in a stable fire, his coat scarred in patterns that told the story of his survival. Jennifer would spend hours applying salve to Phoenix's old injuries, her touch gentle and sure in ways it never was with people. The horse stood patiently for her ministrations, seeming to understand that in caring for his wounds, she was learning to forgive herself for the soldiers she couldn't save. There was David, a Navy corpsman whose nightmares were so vivid he often woke up screaming, convinced he was back in the field hospital with shells falling around him. He bonded with a skittish gelding named Thunder who panicked at loud noises, and together they learned breathing techniques, grounding exercises, ways to calm the sympathetic nervous system when it decided the world was ending. David would press his forehead against Thunder's neck, and they would breathe together, finding peace in the simple rhythm of inhale and exhale, matching their heartbeats until the panic passed. Sully watched all of this unfold with a sense of awe that never quite faded. He had stumbled into this work accidentally, driven by his own pain and his connection with Goliath, but it had become clear that this was what he was meant to do. This was his purpose, the reason he had survived when others hadn't, the reason he had endured all those years of darkness. Not for himself alone, but so he could light the way for others still lost in the shadows. Goliath remained at the heart of the program, his presence both literal and symbolic. He had become the ambassador, the living proof that no trauma was too deep to heal from, no fear too great to overcome. Veterans would come to the ranch skeptical, defensive, armored against hope, and then they would meet Goliath. They would hear his story, see his size and power, learn about the trail of failed trainers who had given up on him. And then they would watch as this supposedly untamable beast walked up to Sully and rested his massive head on the old veteran's shoulder with complete trust, and something in them would crack open just enough to let light in. On the 1-year anniversary of the Goliath Project's founding, the ranch held a small celebration. Sarah came, of course, and brought with her Sully's son Michael, who had been slower to reconcile but was making the effort. Thomas and Margaret provided barbecue and drinks, and the current class of 6 veterans mingled with alumni who had come back to share their progress. The atmosphere was relaxed, filled with laughter and conversation, and watching it all from his spot near Goliath's paddock, Sully felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. Margaret approached him as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She handed him a beer and stood beside him in comfortable silence for a moment before speaking. She told him that what he had built here, what he and Goliath had created together, was changing lives. Not just the veterans who came through the program, but their families, their communities, the ripple effects extending farther than anyone could measure. She said Thomas had been talking about expanding, about buying the adjacent property to bring in more horses, help more people. She said they were grateful he had driven up that driveway all those months ago, grateful he had seen something in Goliath that everyone else had missed. Sully didn't know what to say to all that, so he just nodded and took a sip of his beer. Goliath, sensing attention, came to the fence and pushed his nose over the top rail, seeking pets. Sully obliged, running his hand down the stallion's white blaze, and felt the familiar rush of gratitude and love. This horse had saved his life in every way that mattered, had given him purpose, reconnected him with his children, taught him that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible, had shown him that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply keep trying, keep trusting, keep moving forward even when every instinct screams to shut down and give up. As darkness fell and the celebration continued around them, Sully leaned his forehead against Goliath's and whispered a promise. He would honor this gift he had been given, this second chance at life and meaning. He would keep doing this work as long as he was able, helping others find their own Goliaths, their own reasons to hope. 3 years after Sully first drove his rusted blue truck up the Morrison Ranch driveway, the transformation of both man and horse was complete in ways that defied simple description. Goliath, now 10 years old, had filled out into his full majesty, his white coat gleaming with health, his eyes clear and confident. He moved through the world like royalty, aware of his impact but never arrogant, always gentle with those who needed gentleness, always strong for those who needed strength. The scars from the fire remained, of course, ridges of tissue beneath his coat that would never fully fade, but they no longer defined him. They were simply part of his story, proof that he had survived, that he had overcome. Sully, too, bore his scars with new understanding. The nightmares still came occasionally, the anxiety still spiked in crowds or during storms, but he had learned to work with these responses rather than being controlled by them. He attended therapy now, something he once would have dismissed as weakness, but now understood as another tool in his healing arsenal. His relationship with his children had deepened beyond the tentative reconnection of that first visit. Sarah came to the ranch regularly, sometimes bringing her students to meet the horses and learn about empathy and resilience. Michael had even participated in one of the programs, working through his own inherited trauma, the weight of being a soldier's son who had become a soldier himself. The Goliath project had expanded exactly as Margaret had predicted. The adjacent property had been purchased, and now the program could accommodate 12 veterans at a time, with a waiting list that stretched months into the future. They had added 8 more rescue horses, each carefully selected not just for temperament but for the specific lessons they could teach. There was Mercy, a blind mare who navigated the world through sound and touch, teaching veterans about adaptation and the strength found in vulnerability. There was Titan, a draft horse who had been used for illegal fighting, teaching about the choice between violence and gentleness. There was Hope, a pony who had been abandoned with her foal, teaching about protecting others even when you yourself are in danger. But Goliath remained the heart of it all, the first and forever, the most important. Sully still spent every morning with him, their routine sacred and unchanging, grooming, riding, simply existing together in comfortable silence. These moments grounded Sully, reminded him of how far they had both come, gave him the strength to face whatever challenges the day might bring. The bond between them had evolved into something that transcended the typical relationship between human and animal. They were partners, brothers in arms, survivors who had found each other in the darkness and helped each other into the light. One autumn morning, with leaves turning gold and the air carrying the first real chill of the coming winter, Sully received a phone call that would lead to the most significant moment since the program's founding. A documentary filmmaker had heard about the Goliath project and wanted to tell their story, to share with a wider audience the healing that was happening at this small ranch. Sully's first instinct was to refuse, to protect the privacy and sanctity of what they had built. But after discussing it with Thomas and the current veterans, he realized that sharing their story could help countless others, could plant seeds of hope in hearts that desperately needed it. The filming took place over 3 months, cameras capturing the daily rhythms of life at the ranch, the small victories and occasional setbacks, the tears and laughter and hard-won progress. The filmmaker spent hours interviewing veterans, hearing their stories, understanding their journeys, but it was the footage of Sully and Goliath that became the emotional center of the documentary. The camera captured the way they moved together, perfectly in sync, 2 beings who had learned each other's language so fluently that words became unnecessary. It captured the moment a new veteran, resistant and angry, met Goliath for the first time and felt their armor crack. It captured the gentle power of a traumatized horse helping traumatized humans find their way back to themselves. When the documentary premiered at a film festival, Sully and Sarah attended together, sitting in a darkened theater watching his life play out on the screen. He was uncomfortable with the attention, with seeing himself portrayed as some kind of hero. But Sarah squeezed his hand and whispered that he needed to let people celebrate what he had accomplished, that his humility was admirable. But this story belonged to more than just him. It belonged to every veteran struggling to reintegrate, every animal waiting for someone to see past their trauma to the soul beneath. The response to the documentary was overwhelming. Donations poured in, enough to expand the program further, to help other ranches start similar initiatives, to fund scholarships for veterans who couldn't afford the travel. Media outlets requested interviews, though Sully granted them sparingly, always insisting that the focus remain on the horses and the veterans they served, rather than on himself. But most importantly, the documentary gave hope to people who had forgotten what hope felt like. Letters arrived daily from veterans and their families, from people working with traumatized animals, from anyone who had ever felt broken beyond repair, all saying the same thing in different ways. If Goliath could heal, if Sully could heal, then maybe they could too. On a crisp December morning, as snow began to dust the fields in white, Sully stood in the center of the paddock with Goliath. The ranch was quiet. the current session having ended the week before, the next group not arriving until after the holidays. It was just the two of them, the way it had been at the beginning, and Sully found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. He thought about the scared, broken man who had arrived with nothing but pain and regrets. He thought about the terrified stallion who had been written off as dangerous and unsalvageable. He thought about all the small moments that had led to this one, the patience and persistence, the setbacks and breakthroughs, the choice to keep trying when giving up would have been easier. Goliath walked over and pressed his forehead against Sully's chest, their customary greeting, and Sully wrapped his arms around that massive head and held on tight. "Thank you," he whispered, as he had whispered 1,000 times before. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for teaching me. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to heal, to hope, to become something better than what trauma tried to make us." The stallion stood perfectly still, his breath warm against Sully's coat, and in that moment, everything that had been broken felt whole again. Everything that had been lost felt found, and the future, that vast unknown that had once terrified them both, felt full of nothing but possibility.